I am Abigail Helen. I'm an author, and I'm here with Rowan Hisayo Buchanan, who wrote this amazing book, Harmless Like You. And in the last, did this come out last year and then the paperback this year?
It came out last July, and because of COVID, the paperback is actually going to be delayed until next year.
Oh, wow, okay. Well, that's kind of good, because then we can have a proper real-life party.
Oh, no. Shush. My mother was calling me.
Oh, well, hi to your mom.
It's fine. It was not an emergency. It rings.
It would be hilarious to bring her in to the Zoom meeting to talk about mothers promoting daughters' books, because both Rowan's and my mum do things like walk into bookshops. I know my mum does this, walk into bookshops and then take my books out the shelf and then turn them around this way and put them back on the shelf. And your mum is very good at that too, right?
Yes. Very much.
So I have actually dressed today to be the same color as your book. And look, I did my eyes that color as well. So I'm all promoting Starling Days today.
It's very beautiful.
Thank you. And I'm also, I have a color coordinated cup in which I'm drinking the tea that you sent me. And by the way, I didn't say this to you on text, but for everyone, there's this tea that Rowan has at her house that I completely love. And whenever I'm there, I'm like, please get out the smelly tea that I like. And we just drink copious pots at pits. And I said I want to get some during lockdown, and Rowan said, oh, I'll send some to you. And I thought that you meant that you would just send me the bit that you have in your cupboard, but you actually ordered me some of my own special tea, which was lovely. And it's from this place called My Cup of Tea, with an elephant on the design, and they sent me these as well. It's 2 3-piece, which is very nice. So I'm drinking that right now, and thank you very much for it. So we have you here because I just would be having some nice lunches and hangouts with other authors, I'm sure, if we weren't in lockdown, and we would be having some nice times walking your lovely dog Azuki at the beach, but we're not doing that at the moment because you're way away and I'm here. So I thought that we could have a nice chat, and I could ask you some worky questions that I don't usually ask you about your writing, and that other people could watch, which would be cool. So my first question was about when you got into writing and what baby Rowan was like.
Okay, so baby Rowan had a baby brother who is now less of a baby and is always annoyed when I tell the story. But he was very difficult and basically would just be annoying and throw things at me or hit me with his tiny baby hands, and unless I told him a story. And so I would just make up these stories, but I never knew how they should end. So they always ended with every single character dying. That was the only way in which I understood an ending. So everyone would have to get struck by lightning or die because of a meteor or an avalanche. And every time he would make me promise, they're not going to die this time. They can't die. And I would have to say, yeah, they're not going to die. And then they would always die. So I think that either a very terrible big sister or a baby writer, one of the two. And then I sort of did it for fun.
For readers, do all your books end like that now?
No, they do not all end like that. Most of my characters survive.
Good to know.
Who knows? Maybe someday. Maybe my 7th book, I'll kill everyone.
And what was your journey after being baby Rowan and telling these pretty frightening, I assume, stories? At what point did you think that could be a profession, frightening people?
Okay. So for anyone listening, my accent might be confusing because it's a bit British and it's a bit American. And that's because I grew up in Britain and my dad's British, but my mother's American and I went to university in America. And for those of you who don't know, in America, you do pick a particular subject to major in, but you also take other classes. So I had picked economics because I thought that sounded very, very sensible. And like it would get me a good job.
Yes.
But a friend of mine said, oh, just maybe do you want to take one creative writing class? Like, I think you'd love it, because they knew how much I loved reading and stories. And so I said, yeah, that sounds amazing. And it turned out, in order to be able to take the higher level creative writing classes in my school, you had to be a creative writing major. And so I ended up double majoring in economics and creative writing, thinking I'm still going to do the economics, and the creative writing will just be for like joy and fun, and because I'm a nerd who thinks taking more classes is good.
Yeah.
And it turned out that I had a professor who really encouraged me and said, actually, did you know you can go to grad school for this, and you can even get a funded place, so you can basically write for free for 2 years. They won't, you'll earn money while you're there. And that sounded basically like a miracle to me. And this was also in 2012, when we were just recovering from the financial crisis, but not really. None of my friends were really able to get jobs when they were graduating, or not the jobs that they had trained to do. And so it seemed like not that big a risk. And so I did it. And then a professor there said, you could get an agent, you could become a published novelist. And basically, I've just been clinging on ever since.
Yeah, that's definitely what it feels like. That is crazy. I didn't know that. I didn't know any of that. But that's really cool as well. I always feel like when you really understand how some people become writers, you find that it's a much more human journey than the idea of like, oh, this person's an author. It seems like such an intangible thing, and particularly an intangible career path. Like there's no ladder per se. That's really cool. And were you really interested in economics?
Yes. The problem was the part of economics I was interested in was the part which basically uses statistics and modeling to try to better understand what people are doing and why they're doing it. So, for example, it might be sort of measuring what changes to class size, like what effect that has on people in the long term in terms of earnings, but also in terms of getting incarcerated or not getting incarcerated, and therefore like what changes could the government make that would help people. I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think I still do, and I'm very grateful that I had that training when I read the newspaper, and I feel a bit better able to understand it than I might otherwise, and I feel more confident sometimes to think, wait, is that bullshit? But I ended up realizing that I really enjoyed a lot of it.
Yeah.
But that I just like and most naturally think about people one by one rather than in groups, even though economics is a way of attempting to model that is very, very difficult, and there isn't a perfect way of doing it. And I'm all for people using whatever tools that they can, but for me, my brain thinks best about people one-on-one, which more naturally lend itself to fiction.
I think that sounds like you had such a good education, because you got to do these two quite separate strands actually that very much complemented each other and were really about the same thing, and figure out what appeals to you and what doesn't appeal to you really specifically.
Yeah, I'm very grateful I got to do it. Although my dad always said economics is just creative writing, which, he's a dad.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah.
My tiny little tidbit as well. I did statistics at GCSE, and I really loved it. So I love that is something that weirdly we have in common. And I was just reading Coralie, a friend of mine who she's just has acquired an agent for her young adult novel, which is about maths and maths problems. And I was reading it and thinking back and thinking how much fun that was actually, and how cool it is. I always think that when I hear about an American education and that you get to do lots of different things, actually gives you kind of an appreciation for lots of different spheres of the world. So moving on, because, you know, we've got to upload these to Instagram, so they're not going to be super long interviews. You wrote an article recently for LitHub on kingdoms of the sick and well. Did you write that before the pandemic, or was that during, or?
I actually wrote it before the pandemic, and I was editing it as in sort of the first stages were hitting Britain. And that essay is actually mostly about mental health.
Yes.
But I think, you know, you never want to force something by saying everything is relevant to the pandemic. Some things are more relevant and some things are less relevant. But to me, it still felt important to put out there because I knew that the pandemic would be putting a lot of pressure on people's mental health. And
well, yeah, I mean, you have a
that essay isn't about telling anyone.
Yeah, sorry. Our internet's laggy, just to explain to people. Both of us, I think, have laggy internet. And so we will probably talk over each other now and again, but we're not doing it on purpose. But what I just wanted to say is that, like, just because you have a pandemic doesn't mean that everything else goes away. And when we look at, like, you know, the rates of people who get sick and sadly die and stuff, we're not taking into account, you know, suicides or cancers that don't get treated, or, you know. And so I mean, I really enjoyed your article for the relevance, I think, to writing when everybody around you is sick, and kind of trying to keep that faith and why we write. But I also, you know, enjoyed the mental health aspect. And I wanted to quote you. You said, "I understand the world through stories, and I wanted to better understand the journey between the kingdoms. Recently, I spoke to a friend about the idea that telling a story is like drawing new constellations. Each star is a chemical reaction, too hot to approach. Yet we stand on Earth and we draw a bear, a warrior, a dog, a bird, two people in love. It's how we manage the vastness of outer space. Maybe next time I'm asked, I should say I wrote this novel because my sky was so full, and this is the star map I made." I just thought that was beautiful. And I'm sure, lots of other people did too. And I wanted to ask you about writing, because you're so frank about the fact that at one point you tried to take your own life, which I, you know, feel like you're so brave talking about that. Because it does help people, I think, to see people that have gone through that and come out the other side. And I'm always nervous about talking about that kind of stuff, because I don't want that to have happened, you know. And but I understand that that's probably not that helpful to, like, just be like, let's just sweep it under the rug and pretend that these things don't happen, because I just don't want to know that people feel that badly. You know, I don't want to ever think that you have felt that badly. But I wanted to talk to you about writing about trauma, because Mina in Starling days has also had a situation where she has tried to take her own life. And actually the book begins with her standing on a bridge, and then the policemen come and they say, like, you know, we've got to take you away, we can't leave you here. Which is interesting, because according to her, she's not thinking about jumping off the bridge. And so it becomes this kind of episode where you're thinking, actually, that, like, it's like women can't be left alone or something, because that's what they might do. So it's a really interesting, multi-layered situation to open the book with. And I wanted to ask you about, like, is it time that's got you to a point where you can write about that kind of trauma and that kind of, you know, feelings of depression or sadness, or however you put it? And do you feel like in writing about Mina, you wanted to make a comment on your own experiences, or is it divorced from them?
Thank you for thinking about that so carefully. So for people who haven't read the book and who don't know me, Mina is in her early 30s and she's just married. in the time that Abby's talking about, when I tried to kill myself, I was a teenager. So there's a lot that she and I don't have in common that are different. And I think for me, one of the reasons for that is I've never had a lot of interest in memoirs. I love reading memoirs, but I don't feel a need to write down, this is the progress of my life. However, in my fiction, I want to think about what it means to be a human and what it means to move through this world and what it means to try to make a life and try to survive. And to some extent, for me, like for all writers, that's going to be mediated through my life, through the things I felt and thought. So I'm sure that, and I'm sure and I know that the experiences I had informed me as I was writing this fiction, but it also is informed by other conversations I've had as I've gotten older, experiences that people dear to me have had. And what I want to transcribe most was not the specific facts of the matter, but how the experience felt as a human to move through, and to try to write a book that might help someone who never felt that way understand it better, and someone who had felt that way, or a way that was similar but not identical, feel like they had a compatriot, someone by their side. Because for me, when I was struggling, and maybe this is what informs the book most, I didn't want to read escapism, actually. I didn't want to read things that were beautiful and shiny and different. I wanted to find a story that looked like my story, so I might see someone who had made decisions and understand what decisions they were making and how and why. Basically a friend. And I think I wanted this book to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I mean, this is kind of I just made a note of something I'm going to ask you later because it ties into one of my later questions. But I wanted to ask you as well, and this is kind of a cheeky question. You may not want to totally answer it, because the headline question is, what causes meanness, sadness? Because in the book, I think, like, it was very unclear, you know, and I think that I feel that you did that intentionally. But, you know, I wanted to know, like, it's a question about the chicken and the egg as well, because she is in a relationship with Oscar. She's just got married. She's 32, and she ends up considering this affair with Phoebe, and whether she might leave Oscar, and what is her relationship about, and is she going to spend a long time with that person? And I'm wondering, is it her sadness that she carries around with her all the time that leads her to question this relationship, or is it that there's some sort of kind of inherent trauma in committing to somebody and realizing you're never going to be lots of things? Because when you're with one person, you can think, okay, well, I love them, but because of them I can't be this, I can't live here. Maybe they don't have a passport, their job wouldn't travel in the same way, particularly like as writers, that we can travel around. And that kind of trauma as well, of being like, oh wow, now I have to be all these things, or I am all these things because I'm with this person, and maybe there's pressures from their family that I wouldn't have otherwise, or, you know, they are this sort of person and I love them, but now I'm a different person, you know. It kind of like solidifies who you are, and maybe there's kind of a trauma in that. Does the sadness lead to the relationship questioning, or is the relationship questioning part of her greater sadness?
That is a really interesting way of asking that question. I think, so one of the things Mina struggles with in the book is understanding exactly why this has happened to her, why her mental health medication stopped working. And I think one of the things she's struggling is we understand mental illness in two ways. We understand it as sickness, as disease. And sometimes with sickness, you can really trace it. You can say, okay, someone sneezed on me and that's why I'm ill. But with some diseases like cancer, you think, is it because I smoked? Is it because I lived in a polluted area? Is it because I'm unlucky? Is it because of my genetics? And in some ways, she experiences questioning why she's suffering in this way, like that. Like, is it just something that's happening in my body? She discovers that she has polycystic ovaries. One of the comorbidities for that is depression. So she thinks, this is just my ovaries? That seems almost sexist to say, like, my ovaries have made me mad. Is it the pressure of being 32 and being an adjunct and not having a lot of job stability, even though they're also fairly comfortably middle class in some ways? But also she's, she gets very frightened because she's crying while she's teaching, and she's going to lose her job because of it. And so is it the pressure of work? Is it trying to be a person who can live up to her husband's expectations? And all of these things sort of begin to sit on her.
Yeah.
And in some ways, this book is the book of a relationship. And for readers who haven't read it, there are moments of joy and exploration too. It's not just sadness. But,
I didn't find it a sad book. I didn't. I know lots of people do, but
it's also, and the pressures fall on Oscar as well, that sort of being in your early 30s and suddenly realizing that all of the choices you make have really long-term implications.
Yeah.
Your job, this is the time you're trying to make it in your job for a lot of people. If you're getting married, then maybe you'll get divorced and you'll get married again, but likely this is going to be a big milestone in your life, even if you get divorced later.
Yeah, or a big
but this is not something.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're choosing where you're going to settle, where your forever life is, even if you change it later. And so there's all of these pressures coming down on you that as you sort of settle into your adult life, it's not quite a midlife crisis. Midlife crisis is being like settled and having decided you've done the wrong thing. It's sort of in advance of that crisis going, am I doing the right thing? So they have these pressures that anyone has already anyway. And then there's this layer of Mina feels like something's going wrong in her brain. And sort of how does that complicate it? What pressures does it add? And one of the things the book's about is the way Mina tries to escape that. Whether that's meeting a beautiful woman or trying to actually write this essay about classical women who survive.
Yeah. That's I really one of the things I really loved about Starling Days was that it takes a 32-year-old woman. I think so often people write about women in their early 20s and think, well, it's basically the same thing. But it's really not. It's a completely different time of your life. And I'm not a kind of a believer in maybe a maturity journey so much as I am a believer in that you just know certain things more at the time. Like when I was a teenager, I spent all my time around hundreds of people, some of whom I didn't get on with. And so I was really adept socially, whereas now I spend all my time alone and I'm less adept socially, but I know maybe a little bit more about being in a long-term relationship and how that works in terms of relationships. But yeah, I think being 32 is really different to being in your sort of early to mid 20s. And I also think, one of the things I love so much, I'm gonna take this welcome to Mac OS High Sierra off my screen because it will be recorded. One of the things I loved about it was that, and you said earlier that when you were, feeling very down, you didn't want to read escapism. It doesn't escape. It's very much set, the majority of the book, in London, in this apartment. It's not like a grand place. It's not a flashy place that you could aspire to be. It's just a normal, I think, sort of post-council or ex-council flat, right? And I so knew that. I mean, I moved to one of those places when I moved to London at 19. And it felt very much, it was a story about place. And there's, in the States at the moment, they're saying that you should shelter in place. I mean, not the government necessarily, but they call it sheltering in place, what we're doing at the moment. And I think that's a weirdly beautiful phrase for something that's kind of frightening. But your novels all have this really strong sense of space. I say all, these two that you have written so far. and two of many, I'm sure. But I was wondering, where does place enter into your writing? And, you know, is it something that you start with? Because it's such a strong sense in both of these books that, I mean, this is based in New York and Berlin, and this is set in London. And my point earlier, I was distracted by the thing on the screen, was that you don't like try and make it flashy by setting it in Italy, or, you know, you're really talking about somebody's real life, and you're making this like reasonably ordinary woman's life really important by writing a book about it, which I really loved. And it's not important because she goes on holiday or because she does something extraordinary. You're just there with her all the time, which I think that I don't often see in a literary novel. So yeah, is place one of the first things that inspires you, or does it come later? Do you have to have been to a place? Did you go to Berlin while you were researching this book? Do you have to get the feel of somewhere? And are there certain stories that just wouldn't work in any other place? Like, for instance, Starling Days. Was it something that had to happen in London?
That question has many parts, all of which I find interesting.
Okay, so in terms of writing, where does place come in to it?
Okay, so for me, place is really, really important. I think because my characters are fictional, as much as, you know, I might have taken a story from a friend or a haircut from someone I saw on the street, they're fundamentally made up. And the plots that happen are plots, they're fiction. And so for me, having somewhere real to ground it really helps me, because it helps me have a way to walk into that world. I do an exercise with my students where I make them draw a place they know well and then write a fictional story in it, and they usually enjoy it. So I'm doing this with myself all the time. And actually with Starling Days, it was based on the flat that someone I know used to live in, and a mutual friend of ours has just read the book, and she messaged me and she was like, "Is this so-and-so's flat?" And I was so proud of myself. That I had conveyed this plot, even though basically 2 readers will know that. So there is where I start. Often, therefore, when I'm beginning to imagine a story, I'll imagine it in a place that I know pretty well. And so in Harmless Like You, they move to a house in Connecticut next to a graveyard. And that's actually based on the house of an exes of mine's parents. And when they were designing the book jacket for Harmless Like You, one of the early ideas was a woman with a house on her head. And they asked me, like, did you have a particular house you were referencing? And at that point, they were an ex. And so I was like, yes, here is the Google Earth view of this house. And they didn't end up going with it, which is probably for the best. But so it is usually ground in place. But sometimes then I decide that I need to get to know the place better as I'm writing. So in Harmless Like You, most of the book takes place in the United States, in New York and in Connecticut, but there are some sections that are in Berlin. And I'd been to Berlin before. I had thought that it made sense for this character to go to Berlin because of the art scene, because she's trying to escape the country she's in. And then...
It's Rowan. We are recording.
Oh, sorry.
But you can say hi. My partner, Phil. I know, babe. You know.
Thank you.
So, sorry, go on.
Okay. Fine. So I've been to Berlin before, but I wanted to get to know it better. So as I was writing the book, I actually went back to go again and to follow where I thought my characters would be, to take notes and pictures about the area. And I felt that was enough, because the character who narrates those sections is in Berlin for his first time. So I felt able to write it from his view as a stranger to Berlin, all the things you would see and notice and be really aware of.
Yeah.
So that happens for that. But in Starling Days, actually, there's a very important scene that happens in the Columbia Road Flower Market. And I went back there again and again as I was reading that scene. I even took audio recordings of what people were saying, because the flower sellers there use very particular phrases as they try to persuade you to buy sunflowers or peonies. And so it is the thing I probably have the most physical research doing.
Yeah, and you feel when you're in Columbia Market, that's I think a part of the book that a lot of people mention, isn't it? Because it's such a, we all know it as Londoners, and it's a very visceral place, or like there's lots of noise and smells, and you really bring that to life in the book. I think that's kind of part of the book that seems a bit like one of the hearts of it. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, again, I'm keeping this short because I'm uploading it to Facebook. So, babe.
Yes, Nana.
Everything you're doing is reasonably loud, and I'm
sorry.
Recording.
Okay,
and if I did this while you were doing a podcast,
no, I understand.
Can you just give me 5 minutes?
Less actually.
Can you give me 5 minutes? Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to keep that in. But because we're all working from home, and I'm sure everybody would understand. So firstly, I wanted to say thank you very much for being my prototype interview, and for being a wonderful friend and an amazing writer. And I think I didn't say earlier, but I met you through your book because I loved it so much, and you read my book Golden Boy, and we decided to have a cup of tea. So I just wanted to ask as well before we head off. Number one, what is a book that you are reading right now, or a book that you have just read that you would recommend to people reading in lockdown?
So I've just finished reading Actress by Anne Enright, which is beautiful, and sorry, my device is making noise and I thought I turned it off. Anyway, but Actress by Anne Enright, which is a story told from the point of view of the daughter of a very famous Irish actress, fictional, and the description of her mother's breakdown. And it does really interesting things with jumping back and forth in time, and it's like very artful and literary and observant, but she also has a great hook, which is that her mother shot a man. And you sort of go back and find out why, or the ways in which you can't know exactly why. Anyway, I very much recommend it.
Okay, cool. Well, that definitely sounds like one I'll be reading. It sounds a little bit like White Oleander. Have you ever read that book by Janet Fitch? It was a movie as well. Really good.
Watch it or read it or both.
Yeah, it's a groovy book, and then the movie with Alison Lohman is really good. And to finish, I wanted to ask you, who do you think I should interview next?
Ooh. Well, I think we both really like Milan Tan, and because of she's usually Berlin-based, but because everything is happening on Zoom, maybe she would be a good guest.
That's such a good idea. I didn't think, you kind of think like, oh, the London people, because that's who you think of, but I think that's a really good idea. I will ask her. Okay, thank you so much. This has been lovely, and we did the technology thing pretty well as well. So where are you going now? I'm going to have some biscuits.
Now? Probably snack. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is why.
Yes, exactly. Right now we'd be like, okay, biscuits. Cool. Okay, well, I love you lots, and I will talk to you very soon. Not recorded in front of people, probably next time, but this was really lovely. Okay.
Bye.
Love you. Bye.
Love you.